First step on the stage 2 is the intake system we're going to install. First of all, we got to get the old intake out. Going to loosen up the hose clamp, disconnect the mass airflow sensor here. Put it out of the way, and there's 3 clamps over here on the side, and disconnect that. So we'll go through here. Okay, so now we've got our removed lid. Now that we've got our intake lid off, I'm going to remove this. We're going to loosen up and actually take out our mass airflow sensor, but make sure you do that all one time, install it in a new one so you're not damaging the sensor in here and getting dirt or debris on it where you don't want it. It's got the intake out, the top lid off, the filter out, reaching down here and twisting these little brackets that lock it in place. These are pretty stuck on here, so you do have to give a little bit of a tug to get them out. Once you get loose, kind of wiggle it right out there. Make sure your wires are out of place. And now we've got the stock intake box out. Note, you got your grommet over here. We're actually going to remove this from the stock intake, and we're going to actually install it on our aftermarket intake for the Jammer. All right, we can take our stock grommet back, put it in this Jammer intake here. Make sure it's nice and fit, it's not wrapped around there. Okay, once we have that installed, we'll actually slip this back in there. So that goes in there nice and smooth. You'll have your stock bolt that we'll put back in over here. Make sure that locks it back into place. All right, so that's nice and tight. Everything's around that air intake, nice and good there. Now we'll install the mass airflow sensor and the lid back on here, and we'll be about done. Like we mentioned before, we have our mass flow sensor here, so we're going to take that off. All right, get the screws out. Now this is where I want to be careful that I'm not touching anything on here. Preparing it, make sure it's clean. If yours appears dirty, they do have mass airflow sensor cleaner you can put on there, make sure it's dry. Go with the instructions on how to clean that if you need to. We have our mass airflow sensor out. I pre-installed the intake to the intake tube here. Put the hose clamp, tighten it nice and clean. We actually provided rubber grommet here. We're going to put our mass airflow sensor on it, keep a nice good seal. Remember, be careful so you're not touching the ends here. We'll put that back down in there. And we're actually going to take the supplied screws to bolt that into place here. Got the bolts, screws in here. Twist those in place. Don't overly tighten them. And once you get one in, put the other one in before you tighten it up so they line up nice and easy. And you're going to pull it right down into that grommet so it's nice and flush. Okay, inspect that, make sure everything looks like it's nice and flush on there, looks good. So as you notice, these will actually bolt into the bottom of the intake box. So we want to make sure they line up. I'm going to put this hose back over the intake tube inlet there and use the hose clamp and tighten that back up. Right, make sure that's on there tight. It's in place. Once you got everything in place there, start to tighten that clamp up. These holes should line up so we can put our lid on and sandwich everything in place. Make sure your intake tube here is nice and tight. Make sure it's completely on. Check the bottom with your fingers so you can inspect it. If it's not on tight and it blows off, we'll have some issues there, so we want to make sure it's nice and tight, keeping everything clean. Okay, nice and tight, wiggle around, looks good to me. Now we're going to take our intake lid, put it on top of the intake box here, line everything up, should fit nice and smooth, clamp down tight. We have our 4 provided screws for the box. The 2 longer ones are going to be on the inside of the engine component to make sure you reach. The 2 shorter ones are going to be on the outside, the wheel well area. On this part, make sure you start to tighten them all a little bit and equally get them starting to tighten down so we don't over tighten one side versus the other. Everything's nice and tight. We finish off these there. Make sure all the 4 are tight. Once they're all tight there, we're going to come back, plug in our mass airflow sensor. It does have that red clip, so make sure it plugs in nice and tight and it shuts over. All right, so we've got installed. We've got the mass airflow sensor in there. We removed our filter reminder on our stock one. This is actually going to go back here in this hole. Grommet will just fit right in there nice and smooth. Make sure it's fully in, everything's good. You can do that with the intake tube out if you want. I like to do it after, just so I make sure I have room to do it all. Once I take this, we're going to put the filter reminder in on this side. Push it in nice and tight. Once it's in there all the way, your filter reminder is in there, and we're done with the jammer intake install.